Welcome back to the deep dive. I have to say, the energy in the studio today is definitely different.
Oh, absolutely. We're opening a file that is, well, it's arguably the most critical case study in the history of the Global South.
Yeah, we are looking at how an empire at the absolute peak of its military and economic power began to be dismantled.
And not by an opposing army, which is the crazy part.
Right. Not by an army, but by a group of lawyers, journalists, and thinkers who were armed with uh, really nothing but petitions and a completely devastating economic argument.
It is a truly fascinating story because, we often view history through this lens of dramatic revolutions and bloody wars. But today we are looking at a quiet intellectual revolution.
The one that happened in India between 1885 and 1905.
Exactly. We are talking about the foundation of the Indian National Congress and that really fascinating and honestly often misunderstood era known as the moderate phase.
Right. And just to set the context for everyone listening right now, this isn't just a casual history chat. This is a very specific, targeted mission today.
Yes, we have a clear objective.
We do. This is a full summary for UPSC focused by Simplified UPSC by PPP YouTube channel with PYQ linkage.
Meaning, we are drilling down into the exact, highly specific details you actually need for the syllabus.
We are looking at this through the lens of Spectrum's A Brief History of Modern India, specifically Chapter 11.
So we are going to dissect the ideology, the major controversies like the famous safety valve theory, and of course the economic critique that essentially became the bedrock of Indian nationalism.
Precisely. Now, before we get into the heavy lifting, I do have a humble request for you listening. If you want to really retain this information, if you want to see the timelines and the maps we're going to be talking about today, please go over and subscribe to the Simplified UPSC by PPP YouTube channel.
Visual learning is a huge, huge part of retention for this kind of material.
It really is. And if you are capable, and I really want to emphasize this, only if you are capable, please support us on Patreon.
That support is quite literally the fuel that keeps this content engine running for you.
Absolutely. A massive shout out to all our current supporters. You are the reason we can go this deep into the material and provide these full summaries.
We really couldn't do it without you.
Huge shout out to the squad. Also, do us a favor and hit that like button and share your valuable comments. We actually read them and they help us refine these deep dives to make them super useful for you.
And for the research hunters out there, a quick logistical note.
Oh yes, the notes.
You can get the free notes that accompany this exact discussion, complete with practice, previous year questions, the PYQs right now on our public Telegram channel.
It is the single best way to test yourself immediately after listening to this.
But if you want the real VIP treatment, I'm talking about access to the entire video series at once, plus the organized premium notes, which include detailed notes, extra PYQs, and model mains answers for mains questions.
Yeah, if you want all of that, you need to join us in the private Telegram library. Just DM us on the public Telegram channel to join. It is an absolute game changer for your mains prep.
Okay, I think housekeeping is done. Let's travel back to the late 19th century.
Let's do it. Set the stage for us. Because we always hear about 1885 being this magical year where the Congress is just suddenly born.
Right, like it just dropped out of the sky.
Exactly. But things don't just pop out of a vacuum. What does the political landscape actually look like before 1885?
That is exactly the right question to ask. If you think Congress just appeared out of nowhere, you miss the entire evolutionary process of Indian politics.
So what was happening?
Well, the 1870s and 1880s in India were a time of intense ferment. You had the British Raj firmly established after the 1857 revolt, and they were feeling pretty invincible.
Confident, entrenched.
Very entrenched. But beneath that surface, you had this rising, restless energy.
Who are we talking about here? When we say restless energy, is it the old aristocracy? The kings and landlords?
Well, that is where the massive shift happens. Because earlier in the 19th century, you did have political groups. You had the Bangapasha Prakasika Sabha way back in 1836.
Right. That was associated with Raja Rammohan Roy's circle, wasn't it?
Yes. And later you had the Landholder Society. But look at that name. Landholder.
It's pretty self-explanatory.
It is. These were aristocrats, wealthy zamindars. And their politics were essentially the politics of self-interest. They were lobbying the British for lower taxes on their massive estates.
So they weren't really thinking about India as a unified political entity?
Not at all. They were essentially trade unions for the incredibly rich. But by the 1870s, a totally new class steps onto the political stage.
The educated middle class.
Exactly. These are the products of the new English education system. They are lawyers, journalists, doctors, teachers.
And they've been reading.
Oh, they've been reading a lot. They've read John Stuart Mill. They've read Spencer. They've studied the American Revolution and the Italian unification.
So they have this global perspective on liberty and rights.
Then they start looking at their own country, looking at the poverty in the administration, and they start asking very, very uncomfortable questions.
Okay, this is what we call the precursor phase. And for the UPSC exam, we need to be very specific about these early associations because the examiners love asking things like, which came first? Or who founded what?
They absolutely do. It's a classic prelims trap.
So let's break it down geographically. Let's start with Bengal because that really was the hotbed of all this early intellectual activity.
Bengal is crucial. First, you have to know the East India Association.
Okay, East India Association.
Now, this is a trick question waiting to happen.
Yeah.
Because it was founded in 1866, but it wasn't founded in India. It was organized in London by the grand old man himself, Dadabhai Naoroji.
London?
Yeah.
I mean, that seems completely counterintuitive. If you want to change policies in India, why set up shop in London?
It was actually a deeply strategic move. Naoroji understood that the real levers of power weren't in Calcutta. They were in London.
The British Parliament.
Exactly. He wanted to influence the British public directly. He honestly believed that the average British voter was fair-minded.
So he thought if they just knew the truth, they would help.
Right. He believed that if the British public knew how badly India was being mismanaged and impoverished, they would vote for change. So he took the fight directly to their doorstep.
Okay, so Naoroji is over there working the London crowd. What is happening on the ground back in Calcutta?
You have the Indian League forming in 1875, started by Sisir Kumar Ghosh.
And his goal was what, exactly?
His goal was explicitly stimulating the sense of nationalism among the people. But, and this is the one you really need to double underline in your mental notes, the most important precursor is the Indian Association of Calcutta.
The Indian Association of Calcutta, founded in 1876.
Yes, 1876.
Led by Surendranath Banerjee and Ananda Mohan Bose. Why do you rank the specific one so much higher than the others?
Because it superseded the Indian League, and it functioned as the true prototype for the Congress. Surendranath Banerjee was an absolute powerhouse of a leader.
He wasn't just sitting in a drawing room writing letters.
No, he was traveling the country. He was organizing. And crucially, the Indian Association deliberately kept their membership fees very low.
To attract the poorer sections of the middle class.
Exactly. Unlike the Landholder Society, which was exclusive, the Indian Association wanted to be inclusive. They specifically campaigned for Hindu-Muslim unity and a unified public opinion.
And they weren't just debating abstract philosophy, right? They were reacting to actual, highly controversial policies of the time.
Oh, they were deeply reactive to the government. This was the era of Lord Lytton, who was arguably one of the most reactionary and repressive viceroys India ever had.
What was he doing that sparked this?
The Indian Association organized massive, widespread agitations against Lytton's Arms Act, which restricted Indians from carrying weapons. They fought against the Vernacular Press Act, which basically tried to gag Indian language newspapers.
And the ICS age limit issue, right?
The government reduced the maximum age limit for the Indian civil service exams. It was a blatant move to make it impossible for young Indians to clear the exam. Banerjee led a massive all-India campaign against this.
So they were already doing the heavy lifting of creating a national public opinion almost a full decade before the Congress was even a thought.
They laid the tracks. Congress just drove the train.
Okay, moving across the map, what is the scene over in Bombay?
Bombay is highly active, too. You have the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha, founded in 1867.
1867, and the key name here is?
Mahadev Govind Ranade. The name Sarvajanik literally translates to for all people. Ranade envisioned this organization as a vital bridge.
A bridge between who?
Between the government and the people. He wanted it to legally and peacefully represent the wants of the people to the British administration. And then, jumping forward just a bit, right before Congress is formed in 1885, you get the Bombay Presidency Association.
Ah, the famous Bombay Triumvirate.
Exactly. Badruddin Tyabji, Feroza Shah Mehta, and K.T. Tulung. They were the intellectual giants of Western India.
And down south in Madras, we can't forget the south.
Madras formally enters the chat in 1884 with the Madras Mahajan Sabha.
Led by men like M. Veeragavacharya, B. Subramania Iyer, and P. Anandacharlu.
Right. So if you zoom out and look at the whole picture, the landscape is incredibly clear.
By 1885, all the ingredients for a national movement are already sitting there on the counter.
They are. You have highly active, politically aware groups in Calcutta, in Bombay, and in Madras. They are educated, they are deeply agitated by colonial policies, and they're highly organized on a regional level.
They just needed a container, a single platform to bring all these regional leaders into one room.
Precisely. The national consciousness was percolating, and ironically, the physical infrastructure built by the British, the railways, the postal system, the telegraph, that is what finally allowed these regional leaders to easily communicate and travel to meet each other.
Which brings us to the main event, December 1885.
The birth of the Indian National Congress.
It happens in Bombay at the Gokhale's Tejpal Sanskrit College.
72 delegates show up from all over the country.
W.C. Bonnerjee is elected as the first president. And this is the massive historical curveball, the guy organizing the whole thing, the general secretary, is an Englishman, Alan Octavian Hume.
A retired English civil servant, no less.
This is where we have to stop and really unpack this, because on the surface, it makes absolutely zero sense. Why would a member of the ruling British establishment spend his retirement helping to organize the political resistance against that very establishment?
It is the million-dollar question of modern Indian history, and it has sparked decades of intense historical debate.
This brings us to the safety valve theory.
Yes. The safety valve theory essentially suggests that A.O. Hume did not do this out of some pure love for Indian liberty. He did it to save the British Empire.
Okay, explain the mechanics of that theory. How does creating a national political party for Indians actually save the British Empire? It sounds contradictory.
Think of the Indian political climate in the 1880s as a giant pressure cooker. There was immense, widespread discontent. You had terrible famines, crushing poverty, and those repressive laws by Lord Lytton we just talked about.
The pressure was building
Rapidly. Hume actually claimed that he had access to secret police reports, thousands of volumes of them, that indicated a massive, violent, grassroots uprising was brewing.
Something that could make the 1857 revolt look small.
Exactly. So the theory goes that Hume, and potentially the viceroy at the time, Lord Dufferin, wanted to provide a literal safety valve.
A way to let the steam out.
Right. Provide a safe, polite, constitutional forum where educated Indians could gather once a year, vent their grievances, pass some polite resolutions, and feel like they were being heard.
Letting off the steam harmlessly so the whole cooker wouldn't explode into an armed rebellion.
According to this theory, yes, that was the grand British design. And what's fascinating is how this theory was later weaponized by two very different ideological groups.
Who used it?
First, you had the extremist leaders within India, like Lala Lajpat Rai. He used the safety valve theory to attack the moderates. He essentially said, look, your Congress is a begging institute. It was created by a British man to protect British interests, not to win our freedom.
Wow. So he used it to delegitimize the entire founding of the party.
He did. And later, you had Marxist historians, most notably R.P. Dutt.
What was the Marxist take on it?
Dutt called the founding of Congress a bourgeois conspiracy. He argued that the British and the wealthy Indian elite colluded to create Congress specifically to stop a real popular revolution by the peasants and workers.
It is a very compelling narrative, the grand British conspiracy. But as we know, history is rarely that simple. Does the safety valve theory actually hold up to modern historical scrutiny?
The short answer is no. Modern historical analysis largely rejects the conspiracy aspect of it.
On what grounds?
Well, first of all, those secret police reports that Hume supposedly saw, nobody has ever found them. In all the archives in India and London, there was no trace of them.
So Hume might have just been exaggerating to get people to listen to him.
Very likely. Secondly, look at Lord Dufferin's reaction.
Yeah.
If he conspired with Hume to create the Congress as a helpful safety valve, he changed his mind incredibly fast.
Right. Didn't he turn against them almost immediately?
He did. Within a few years, Dufferin was openly mocking the Congress. He called them a microscopic minority and accused them of being a factory of sedition. You don't call your own secret project a factory of sedition.
Okay, so if it wasn't a British conspiracy to save the empire, why did the Indian leaders, who were incredibly smart, skeptical men, why did they accept a British man like Hume as their chief organizer?
This is where we get to the rebuttal, and it's brilliant. It's the lightning conductor theory, formulated by G.K. Gokhale.
The lightning conductor. I love this concept.
It's the best explanation because it highlights the sheer political savvy of these early Indian nationalists.
How does Gokhale explain it?
Gokhale argued, look, we weren't naive. We knew exactly who Alan Octavian Hume was. We knew he was British. But we also knew the political reality of 1885.
Which was.
which was that if a group of Indians tried to launch an all-India political organization entirely on their own, the British government would have crushed it instantly.
They would have seen it as a threat and banned it.
Immediately. They would have branded it seditious, arrested the leaders, and that would be the end of it. So the Indian leaders needed a British face as a shield.
They used Hume as a lightning conductor.
Exactly. Let Hume attract the attention. Let him attract the official suspicion. Because he was an ex-civil servant, his British identity acted as a protective cover. It allowed the organization to quietly take root and survive those highly fragile early years without being smashed by the state.
So Hume thought he was using them as a safety valve, but they were actually using Hume as a lightning conductor.
That is exactly it. It's
Yeah.
his political 4D chess.
It's brilliant. It ensured the movement wasn't strangled in the cradle, so Congress survives its birth. Now we enter the first major phase of the movement.
The era of the moderates.
Right. Spanning from 1885 to 1905. So for the next 2 decades, who is running the show? When we use the term moderates, who are we actually visualizing?
We are visualizing the absolute intellectual elite of India. You have to remember names like Dadabhai Naoroji, Ferozeshah Mehta, W.C. Bonnerjee, Surendranath Banerjee, and of course, G.K. Gokhale.
And what was their social background?
Their social base was very specific. They were urban, highly educated, and almost entirely upper middle class or upper class. They were barristers, high court lawyers, prominent journalists, and university professors.
And what was their overarching vibe? Because the label moderate implies, well, it implies they were soft.
It implies caution, yes. And their ideology was fundamentally rooted in 19th century British liberalism.
What did that mean in practice?
This is a crucial point to grasp for the exam. The moderates did not hate Britain.
They didn't.
No. In fact, many of them deeply admired British culture. They admired British common law, British literature, and especially the British system of parliamentary democracy.
They saw Britain as an advanced civilization.
Yes. They actually believed that British rule in India was, in the grand scheme of things, beneficial. They sometimes referred to it as a providential mission.
A providential mission? That sounds almost traitorous to modern Indian ears. How could they justify that?
You have to view it through the context of their time. They looked back at the chaos and the fragmentation of 18th century India, and they saw British rule bringing political unification, a modern postal system, railways, and Western education.
So they appreciated the modernization.
They did. Their core grievance was not that the British were ruling India. Their grievance was that the British were ruling India un-Britishly.
Un-Britishly. That is such a specific phrase.
It is the title of Naoroji's famous book for a reason. They believed that the British people back in England were fundamentally fair, democratic, and just.
So the problem was just the local management.
Exactly.
Wow.
They thought the problem was the selfish, arrogant British bureaucracy operating in India, the bad Englishmen. They genuinely believed that if the good Englishmen back in London just knew the truth about the poverty and the denial of rights in India, they would immediately fix it.
So their entire political strategy was essentially based on information warfare. If we just tell the British Parliament the truth, they will intervene and save us.
That was the core logic. And that logic dictated their methodology, which we usually summarize for the exam as the 3 Ps.
Prayer, petition, and protest.
Right. They worked strictly, uncompromisingly within the constitutional framework. They did not break laws. They held annual meetings. They drafted incredibly detailed, polite resolutions, and they sent endless petitions and memorials to London.
They didn't want a violent revolution. They wanted slow reform.
Exactly. Their ultimate goal wasn't even immediate independence. Their goal was self-government within the British Empire, similar to what Canada or Australia had.
And to achieve that, they operated on a 2-pronged strategy, right?
Yes. Prong 1, create a unified public opinion within India itself. Prong 2, persuade the British public and the Parliament in England.
Which is why they spent so much time and money over there.
They established a British committee of the Indian National Congress in London. They even started publishing a journal called India just to educate the British voter about Indian realities.
Now, it is very easy to mock that approach today. The later extremists called it begging politics. But we have to give immense credit where it is due. Because while their political methods were mild and polite, their intellectual work was absolutely revolutionary.
Without a doubt.
I really want to dive deep into what I consider their greatest achievement, the economic critique of British imperialism.
This is their masterpiece. If the moderates did absolutely nothing else in those 20 years, this economic analysis alone would guarantee their place in history.
Set the baseline for us. Before the moderates came along, what was the standard British narrative about their economy in India?
The standard British narrative, which they taught in schools and proclaimed in Parliament, was essentially, we are developing India. We are bringing a backward nation into the modern world. Look at the thousands of miles of railways we built. Look at the telegraph wires. Look at the massive irrigation canals.
The white man's burden.
Exactly. The narrative was that British capital and British enterprise were enriching India.
And then the moderates step up, led by Dadabhai Naoroji, R.C. Dutt, and Dinshaw Wacha. And they looked at the actual ledger books.
And they said, no. You are not developing India. You are actively draining it of its wealth.
Famous drain theory?
Yes. Dadabhai Naoroji laid out the math in his monumental work, Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. He argued that there was a massive structural, unilateral transfer of wealth from India to Britain.
For which India got absolutely nothing in return.
Nothing in return, no material equivalent. He used a very famous, very visceral analogy to explain it to the masses. The analogy of a sponge.
Drawing riches from the banks of the Ganges and squeezing them down upon the banks of the Thames.
That quote is technically attributed to a British official named John Sullivan, who recognized what was happening early on, but it was the moderates who popularized that image across India.
So how exactly did the sponge work? Because it wasn't just British soldiers literally stealing gold statues, right? It was a legal structural drain.
It was entirely structural. They broke down the components of the drain. The biggest chunk was what they called the home charges.
What were the home charges?
These were expenses incurred in England that were charged to the Indian taxpayer. It included the entire cost of running the India office in London. It included the massive pensions paid to British civil servants and army officers who had retired and moved back to England.
So Indian peasants were paying for the comfortable retirements of British officials in Sussex.
Exactly. And it gets worse. It also included the interest on loans that the British government took out to fight wars that expanded the British Empire outside of India.
India was financing its own subjugation and the subjugation of others?
Yes. Plus the massive profits sent back to England by British capitalists who invested in India.
And what about the railways? Because the British always pointed to the railways as their greatest gift to India. How did the moderates counter that?
The moderates completely deconstructed the railway argument. They pointed out that the railways were built with foreign British capital, and the British government guaranteed those investors a fixed, high rate of interest, usually around 5%.
Even if the railway lost money?
Even if it lost money. And who paid that guaranteed interest? The Indian taxpayer.
Wow. Risk-free capitalism for the British, subsidized by the Indians.
And it wasn't just the financing. The moderates showed how the railways were actually used geographically. They weren't built to connect Indian markets to each other to foster internal trade. They were built to connect the deep agricultural hinterlands to the major seaports.
To suck the raw materials out.
To extract raw cotton, jute, and food grains out of India as fast as possible, and to pump cheap British manufactured goods from the ports deep into the Indian interior.
Which completely destroyed the traditional Indian artisan class and the weavers.
Absolutely devastated them. So the railway wasn't a benevolent gift. It was the main artery of the economic drain.
This critique is just so devastating.
Because it completely destroyed the moral foundation of the Raj. Before this, you could argue the British were benevolent guardians. After the drain theory, the moderates mathematically proved that the extreme poverty of the Indian masses, the famines that were killing millions, it wasn't an act of God. It wasn't because of overpopulation. It was the direct engineered result of colonial economic policy.
They drew a straight line from the starving peasant in Bihar to the policymaker in London.
And that economic nationalism became the first truly common platform for all Indians.
Because it didn't matter what religion you were.
Exactly. Whether you were Hindu, Muslim, Parsi, whether you were from Bengal or Madras, you were all being drained by the same system. This economic critique demanded the Indianization of industry. It demanded the reduction of crushing land revenues and the abolition of the salt tax. It laid the complete intellectual groundwork for the Swadeshi movement, and later, Gandhi's entire economic philosophy.
It is an incredible intellectual legacy. So, beyond economics, let's look at their actual political and administrative campaigns. They spent a lot of time focusing on the legislative councils.
They did. Their primary political demand was constitutional reform. They wanted the legislative councils to be expanded, and they wanted them to have actual, meaningful power.
Because at that time, the councils were basically just rubber stamps for the viceroy, right?
Pretty much. And due to constant moderate pressure, the British finally passed the Indian Councils Act of 1892.
The 1892 Act, was that considered a victory for the moderates?
A very, very partial victory. It did increase the number of additional members in the central and provincial councils, and for the first time, members could actually ask questions of the executive and discuss the budget.
That sounds like a step forward.
It was a baby step. But the moderates were deeply dissatisfied, because the British maintained an absolute official majority in the councils. And while the Indians could discuss the budget, they could not vote on it. They couldn't move any amendments.
So they could complain about the taxes, but they couldn't actually change them.
Right. It was, as they called it, a sham of democracy. They raised the classic slogan, "No taxation without representation."
But they still used those councils effectively, didn't they? Even without voting power.
Oh, they used them masterfully. Leaders like Feroza Shah Mehta and Gokhale turned the council floor into a national soapbox. They used it to expose the defects of the bureaucracy.
Because the press would report on their speeches.
Exactly. Gokhale's budget speeches were legendary. They were so heavily researched, so packed with data, that the British finance members were often terrified to debate him. The moderates used the councils not to govern, because they couldn't, but to ventilate the grievances of the nation and educate the public.
They were playing the long game. What about the administrative side? They had major campaigns there, too.
The biggest one was the demand for the Indianization of the civil services.
They wanted the ICS exams to be held in India and England simultaneously, right?
Yes, because holding it only in London essentially barred most Indians from taking it. Now, why did they want this? Partly for moral reasons to end the blatant racial discrimination, but mostly for economic reasons.
This ties right back to the drain theory.
Exactly. A highly paid British ICS officer sent his savings back to England and eventually took a massive pension back to England. An Indian ICS officer would spend his salary in India, keeping the wealth inside the country.
It all connects. And we also have to mention their stance on civil rights, because I feel like people often forget that the moderates were the original fierce champions of civil liberties in India.
They absolutely were. They were relentless defenders of the freedom of the press and freedom of speech. They argued strongly for the separation of powers, demanding that the judiciary be separated from executive functions.
Because you can't have the police officer also acting as the magistrate.
Exactly. And their commitment to free speech was tested. When Bal Gangadhar Tilak, who, remember, was a rising extremist and a harsh critic of the moderates, when Tilak was arrested in 1897 for sedition.
And the Natu brothers were deported without trial.
Yes. When that happened, the moderates didn't cheer for the arrest of their political rival. They stood up for him, they championed his civil liberties, they understood that if the government could silence Tilak, they could silence anyone. They knew that without the fundamental right to speak and criticize, there is no foundation for a nation.
That is profound. So we have this group of highly articulate, brilliant men. They lay the intellectual foundation. They build the initial political machinery of the Congress. They dismantle the British economic narrative. But as we approach 1905, they are clearly losing control of the narrative.
The tide was turning against them, yes. The extremist faction was rising, and the trauma of the partition of Bengal was looming on the horizon.
So, as historians looking back, how do we evaluate them? If we have to give the early nationalists a report card, was the moderate phase a success or a failure?
It is a very complex evaluation. If you measure them by their stated immediate goals, you could argue they failed. They did not achieve self-government. And despite their brilliant economic critique, they completely failed to stop the economic drain. In fact, British exploitation only increased during their tenure.
And they had one massive, undeniable blind spot.
The masses.
Right, the ordinary people.
That was their fatal flaw. The moderate movement was, by design, a narrow elite movement. It was urban, it was largely upper caste, and it was solidly upper middle class. They simply did not include the peasantry, the factory workers, or women in their political vision.
Why? Why did they exclude the vast majority of the country? Was it just elitism?
Partly elitism, yes.
Yeah.
But they also genuinely believed that the Indian masses were too uneducated, too steeped in tradition, and too divided by caste and religion to participate in modern democratic politics. They felt the masses were unready.
So they thought they had to act as trustees for the poor?
Yes. They believed the nation had to be carefully welded together from the top down before the masses could be brought in.
But the result of that exclusion meant they had absolutely no political muscle.
Exactly. That is the tragedy of the moderates. You can write the most brilliant, logically flawless petition in the history of the world, but if you don't have 1 million angry people in the streets, ready to back up that petition.
The government can just read it, nod politely, and throw it in the trash.
Which is exactly what the British did. The colonial authorities eventually realized that the moderates posed no physical or mass threat to the regime. So they simply ignored them.
But knowing all of that, we shouldn't dismiss them as failures, right? Because they built the house that later generations lived in.
Absolutely. To dismiss them is to misunderstand how historical movements are built. The eminent historian Bipan Chandra has the best assessment of this era. He calls it the seed time.
The seed time.
He wrote, and I quote, "The period from 1858 to 1905 was the seed time of Indian nationalism, and the early nationalists sowed the seeds well and deep."
That is a beautiful way to put it. You cannot have the harvest of 1947 without the brutal, slow work of sowing the seeds in 1885.
Exactly. They achieved massive things. They created the very idea of India as a single modern political entity. They trained a whole generation of Indians in the mechanics of modern political work, how to hold a meeting, draft a resolution, debate a bill.
And most importantly, they created the anti-colonial ideology.
Right. By the time the extremists like Tilak and later the Gandhians came along to launch mass movements, they did not have to spend time convincing the Indian people that the British were exploiting them. The moderates had already proven it, mathematically and indisputably. The foundation was rock solid.
And honestly, the reaction of the British government is the ultimate proof that the moderates were effective.
Yes. If the moderates were just harmless, begging elites, why did the British Empire work so incredibly hard to destroy them?
The attitude shifted drastically.
It went from neutral tolerance to outright hostility. Lord Dufferin called them a factory of sedition. The government actively started deploying the policy of divide and rule.
They started encouraging communalism to break the nationalist unity.
They did. They actively encouraged and sponsored reactionary elements. For instance, they heavily supported Sir Syed Ahmad Khan and Raja Shiva Prasad of Benares to start the United Indian Patriotic Association.
Just to counter the influence of the Congress.
Precisely. The most powerful empire on earth doesn't expend that kind of political capital fighting an organization that isn't a fundamental threat to its existence.
That is the ultimate validation of the moderate phase.
It truly is.
Okay, we have covered a massive amount of conceptual ground today. We've gone from the early precursors to the 1885 foundation, unpacked the safety valve, detailed the drain theory, and evaluated their legacy.
It's a heavy chapter.
It is. Now, let's switch gears. We need to actually verify if you, the listener, are ready for the exam. It is time for the PYQ linkage.
Let's test that retention. This is where we see if the concepts have stuck.
I'm going to throw a concept out based on past papers, and we will discuss how it typically appears in UPSC questions. First up, pre-Congress associations. If a question asks, which association was the most significant precursor to the INC and superseded the Indian League?
You have to instantly mark the Indian Association of Calcutta, founded in 1876.
And the key leaders to associate with that.
Surendranath Banerjee and Ananda Mohan Bose. The examiners love to set traps here. Do not get confused with the East India Association, that is Dadabhai Naoroji in London, and do not get confused with the Indian League, that is Sir Kumar Ghosh.
The Indian Association is the big one because of its all-India outlook.
Exactly. It was the dress rehearsal for the Congress.
Got it. Second concept, economics.
Yeah.
Classic question. Who propounded the drain theory?
The primary gold standard answer is Dadabhai Naoroji, and his book is Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. But be very careful with the options. UPSC sometimes gives you a multiple statement question or a list.
Who else needs to be on that list?
R.C. Dutt, who wrote The Economic History of India, and leaders like G. Subramania Iyer and Dinshaw Wacha. If the option includes all of them as early economic nationalists, you must select all of them. Naoroji started it, but they all built the critique.
Third, PYQ linkage. Let's talk methodology and origins. If a question asks you to distinguish between the safety valve theory and the lightning conductor theory,
remember the pairings. The safety valve theory is associated with the actor, A.O. Hume, and the later critic, Lala Lajpat Rai. The extremists used it as an insult.
And the lightning conductor.
That is firmly associated with G.K. Gokhale. He used it as the defense. If the question asks who formulated the lightning conductor theory to justify the early Congress using British patronage, the answer is Gokhale.
And finally, a sort of geography, history, conceptual link. If you see a quote in the exam about a sponge squeezing the banks of the Ganges to water the banks of the Thames,
that is a direct, vivid reference to the economic critique and the drain of wealth. It illustrates the unilateral transfer. It is a conceptual flag that the relationship was entirely parasitic, not symbiotic.
Right. Brilliant. These are exactly the kinds of specific, nuanced details that separate a general reading of the book from a true UPSC clearing understanding.
Absolutely. In this exam, nuance is quite literally everything.
So, bringing this entire deep dive together, as we close the file on the moderates, what does this all mean for us today? Why does a 19th century petition movement still matter?
I think it matters because it reminds us that massive world-altering changes very often start with quiet intellectual steps. The moderates did not have a massive army. They didn't have millions of followers marching in the streets.
They just had ideas.
They had ideas, and they had the relentless power of analysis. They began the process of dismantling the most powerful, sprawling empire in the world, not by firing a single shot, but by patiently taking apart its moral justification brick by brick.
They proved that the pen and the petition can indeed be mighty, provided it is backed by empirical truth.
And it also reminds us that moderation does not necessarily mean weakness. It takes an incredible amount of intellectual courage to stand up in a legislative council, completely surrounded by hostile, condescending colonial officials, and methodically tell them, you are wrong, and here is the data proving it.
It really does. They were the pioneers. They essentially walked so that the rest of the freedom movement could run.
It is a profound story of resilience, from 1885 Bombay to sowing the very seeds of independence.
All right, that officially wraps up our deep dive into the foundation of the Indian National Congress and the era of the moderates. We really hope you have a crystal clear picture of this crucial phase now.
Before you go, a final important reminder. If you found value in this breakdown, please like, share, and subscribe to Simplified UPSC by PPP.
It really helps the algorithm find other dedicated learners just like you. And again, if you are capable, please consider supporting us on Patreon. It keeps the lights on, it keeps the research going, and it allows us to produce these full summaries.
A massive shout out to our existing supporters. You guys are absolute legends.
And do not forget the Telegram channels. Join the public one for the free notes and those crucial PYQs we just went over.
And if you want the full, comprehensive premium experience, the organized notes, the model mains answers, access to the entire library, DM us to join the private library.
It is the absolute best way to consolidate everything you've just heard. We will leave you with this final thought. The moderates fundamentally believed that if you shine a relentless light on injustice and prove it with data, eventually the world will be forced to correct it.
Is that still true in today's world?
Something to think about as you study. Until next time, keep analyzing and keep learning.
Goodbye, and best of luck with your preparation.